I was asked to introduce the two speakers, so morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present the cast, and I call it the cast of the Mig Diaries, to you here today at this movie hall. Now, catch it, movie hall cast. You guys with me? So myself, Cobus Toerien, ex-Flammy, ex-Air Force, at 8 Squadron, 2 Squadron, 3 Squadron mostly, and then I joined SAA, where I flew Boeing 737-800s with Lionel, and before I went to Airbus. Obviously, Lionel was the captain because he's much older than me, as you can see. So without further ado, so let me first introduce you to the director, the producer, and the writer of the Mig Diaries. Also ex-Air Force, ex-SA captain, now flying for SAAF Air. So Lionel Reid, who summarized the Mig Diaries as the SAAF aerial encounters in Angola, as told by both the SAAF and the Cuban pilots involved. All the facts from both sides, and very unique for sure. For those who have read the book will attest to that. So I'm going to keep it short to allow them to speak, but suffice it to say, Lionel joined the Air Force in 1983, when 70 years old, and then started his SAAF career just across the way from SWAT Corps here at the Air Force gym at Valhalla. He was trained on Harvards and Impalas, received his wings in 1985, and did operational flying tours on the Bosbok at 42 Squadron, and then on Pumas at 19 Squadron. Before becoming a civvy pilot, then joining SAA, where he flew a few sorties. We flew a few sorties together on the 738. So in his words, the Mig Diaries concept started in the late 2015s, slowly gaining momentum, and with each interview, another perspective emerged, and slowly a unique picture was built up. And there were many of these interviews. And trust me, this is a masterpiece. I call it's a factual novel. It reads like a novel, but it's facts. Everything is facts. It was born and soon to be available at theaters near you, and at least at this one. So yeah, it is today. So unfortunately, the main actor, which is Lieutenant Colonel Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria from Cuba, could not be here today. But he visited South Africa and the SAAF Museum in May 2019. I don't know if you met him then. We certainly did. And he ever needs no introduction, unless you have not read the Mig Diaries as yet. It's mostly his story which Lionel wrote for him, and the way he wrote it, and you'll agree with me for those who read it, is just amazing. And suffice to say, he's had far more combat experience than any of us, all in one guy. And what is amazing as combat pilots worldwide, we are so alike. It's amazing. We just, and maybe that's why we have the same, if you have the same passion, you're quite alike. So you'll get to know Eduardo well when reading his story, as told by Lionel. So I'm not going to say anything more for those who haven't read it. So Lionel meticulously merged all these war stories as best as we SAAF and Cuban crew could remember them. That was the problem, making an effort to seek only the truth before building his Angolan conflict into a puzzle that fits perfectly on many occasions, which he will illustrate to you today as well. Then Lionel appointed Director of Visual Effects and Sketches in 2018, and is none other than Sean Mad Max Thackwray here next to me. Also an ex-Flammy, ex-SAA, still flying with the Harvard aerobatic team. I had the privilege to have Mad Max as one of my squadron pilots at 2 Squadron, the Flying Cheetahs, and Cheetah C's in this case, and partaking in the air-to-air refueling demos with the Boeing 707 and the Mach 2V1 aerial combat, which we did in those days in the mid-90s, before meeting again at SAA. It's just a small circle of life, you remember that one. So Sean was born in Potchefstroom, straight into a world of military flying. His dad is a famous helicopter pilot who started flying in the Army Air Corps and retired as the well-known General Thack. I think most of you will know him very well. And thus Sean grew up on various Air Force bases, and his sandpit was an oil drip tray placed on a Harvard cowling. They always say you know the SAAF pilots or the SAAF people by the broken furniture and domkinders. Remember that, right? Yeah, that's us, eh? Yeah. Yeah. So guys, no, I must start from page 1 again, otherwise he'll kick me. So his formal flying lessons happened right here at SWAT Corps. Then as a schoolboy flying at the Defence Flying Club. And he then joined the Air Force, went to Dunnies. His instructor was the late Glenn Warden, so you can see what's going to happen now. And with an instructor like that, it was inevitable that he would end up flying fighters and doing aerobatics. Now listen to this part. Even though he actually asked the streaming board to let him fly choppers. So that almost ruined the friendship. But fortunately, some sense was drilled into him, so he became a flummy. Okay, nothing against the chopper guys, it's just in jest, please. So Sean then flew Impalas at 8 Squadron and Cheetahs at 2 Squadron, and I quote, "Neither Abel Grobbelaar, BBR, nor Cobus Toerien could ever really get me to behave like a responsible jet jock. I suppose because we were so responsible ourselves. I don't know." So from flying, from a charter and then to citizen force pilot, he went to the airlines flying the Boeing 747s at 400s at Cathay Pacific before joining SAA on the Boeing 738, no, 737-200s, I suppose, and then 8s, and then 747s, and all the Airbus types, except for the A350. What a pity, he wrote. I agree with that, same here. So following COVID and a voluntary retrenchment, Sean is now a full-time artist, writer and photographer. His wife pays the bills, whilst he is flying Harvards and pit specials as an airshow display pilot. So it's indeed my honor and a pleasure to present to you Lionel Reid and Sean Thackwray. And again, very welcome to everyone. Thank you.
Hi, good morning everybody. Can everyone hear me at the back? Oh, good. Okay, thanks. Sorry, just have to drown out the generator in the background here. As Chris said, my name is Lionel Reid, and today it's a real honor for me to be here. And I've always been so impressed by the South African Air Force Museum. I mean, the work that the Friends of the Museum do is just incredible, and the work is basically to keep history alive. And in a slightly different way, that's maybe what we tried to achieve with this book. When I was interviewing General Gonzalez for the book, he said to me, "Lionel, this is our last chance to tell the story properly." And we took that on as a big responsibility. We're all getting a little bit older, and time is passing, memories are fading, and on both sides, Cuban, South African, and that's what we attempted to do. So today I'm just going to give you a brief history, overview of how the book came around, and I'm going to take you through one story in the book. There's so many stories in the book, but I'm going to take you through one, and I decided the story today would be the story of Mirage 203, because it's right here in the museum, and it's a real legend within the South African Air Force. So if you had been at the SAAF Museum on the 3rd of May 2019, you would have seen a short, olive-skinned, elderly man busy looking at Mirage 203, walking around it, touching it, peering it into the cockpit, absolutely fascinated by the aircraft. You would have thought there was nothing particularly remarkable about him, but he was probably maybe even the most interesting visitor to the museum that year. His name, Colonel Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria, and he's become a good friend of mine over the years. And he was looking at the kill mark, and there's a long story behind that kill mark. MiG-21 MF. And he and I became friends, and that kill mark is one of the stories that we worked so hard to unlock the full story about. And it brought us together, and we decided to go on a mission together to tell the full story of that day and many others. As we know, the stories have been told in Dick Lord's books. There's excellent books, and they could only be told from the one side. And here's just artwork from Tiro Foster, who also, it's just a complete artist's impression. He wasn't trying to be exactly accurate, because it even shows the MiG-21 that was here, and it's a Biz. It's not the same number, it's not the same variant or number as that day. But there were a lot of legends and stories about that day. And as we dug further, we saw that what we thought was fact sometimes wasn't. So Eduardo and I set out on a mission. So it started in 2015 when we decided. He said to me it's going to be a mission of Olympic proportions. He was right. But the mission got into gear in about 2016, and it was to tell the untold side of the war, the Cuban pilots' side. They had incredibly tough tours in Angola. They went through a lot. They lost more guys than the SAAF did. And it's a story that's never been told in English. There's some memoirs in Cuba, but the economics of the situation makes it that they're in Spanish and then they never really leave Cuba. So we wanted to tell that side. We also wanted to tell the unknown air combat stories of the war. There's some stories that's hardly known. That is Hercules 401, still flying today in the South African Air Force. That crew nearly died in April 1986 when Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria intercepted them at low level at night deep into Angola. His missile came so close that it burnt the paintwork on the left wing, and the rocket motor was still burning and left little weld deposits down the fuselage of the Hercules. All those guys standing there have 30 extra years of life because the proximity fuse from that missile didn't go off. That's just one of the stories. Who would have thought that the person who shot down the most aircraft in the Bush War wasn't a pilot? He was a South African Air Force flight sergeant, the very humble guy, Johan Hammer Strydom. And we wanted to tell his story as well. That's the same line that he used to do it with during its firing trials at St. Lucia. And then to tell the unknown side of the known combats. This is the gun camera footage from 1981, the very first kill that took place, 6th of November 1981, where Johan Rankin shot down a MiG. Unfortunately, in Dick Lord's book, they got the photos the wrong way around. So they show the 1982 gun camera footage for the 1981 kill. That is the true 1981 gun camera footage. And we know the story from the side of the SAAF, and thanks to the Dick Lord. But, sorry. What we don't know is what it was like in that cockpit. So that MiG pilot is still alive today. He's on the right-hand side with the moustache over there. Daniel Valdez Espinoza. And his story appears in the book because he ejected safely. So the Mirages saw the ejection, they saw the parachute, and for them the story ends. But, you know, we wanted to tell his side of the story, how his day went. Didn't go really well, but it was good to know how it went. And he was shot down in MiG C-41. That day, MF. So to do that, it couldn't just be Eduardo and ourselves. He's had some experience at writing. He wrote memoirs back in Cuba, but I've no experience in writing before. And we knew that we needed to get a team that we could work on some things, other things we were going to need a lot of help. So there's Eduardo, as he says, there's wearing in his photo. His wife doesn't allow him to go out when there's a thunderstorm around because he's going to get taken out by lightning for sure. Myself, of my Bosbok days of 42 Squadron, so I never flew Mirages, but I did have 4 years of experience in the Bush War, so I had a very good idea what went on, and that's what I thought I had. As I dug and found more things, I realized that there was so much that I didn't know, so much that still had to be told. And we were lucky enough to have an artist. There's Sean Thackwray, back in his days when he was a defender of the realm and flying cheetahs. Yeah, so he came and he brought the book to life in many ways. He was an incredible part of the team, just his support, his artwork, everything. And then the fourth member of the team is Tim Richmond. He's the owner of Burnett Media, and he's the publisher of the book. He's also authored and co-authored 18 books himself, so he doesn't just put on a normal publisher's hat. He sees the book as a writer, and his support was incredible. He's the first publisher I approached, and he just said, I want in on this. And I think if our book had been taken by Jonathan Ball or one of those big publishers, I think they would have just eaten us alive and would have think, Tim, let us tell the story the way we wanted to. We really wanted to tell the story in our own particular way, which was no politics, just the story of the guys, what it was like for them. So the components to try to tell the story, we needed to tell the most authentic accounts, get the guys to open up and tell us how it really happened. And that's a photo that shows Eduardo in a cockpit before a mission. And it's not a story about steely-jawed heroes. It's about talking about how nervous the guys were and how scared they were. Because anyone who tells you they weren't scared is either Arthur Walker or he's not a normal person. Because we were all scared at times. And what we needed as well was some authentic photographs. And we were very lucky. The guy in the photo there, Milton Diaz-Cantor, he Cuban war photographer and journalist, And he gave us access to a lot of his photos. You're going to see a lot of photos today that aren't in the book. There just simply wasn't space. But we're very lucky to get his photos, and he captured the moment many times perfectly. And he gave us photos that had never been published before. Some of the photos have been published before, and they were never credited to him. They were credited to the Alberto Grandadini collection by Helion and these guys. But these are Milton's photos, and some of these photos are just at the moment. He caught them at the time. But initially, it was a struggle to get enough photos. The photos did, because the project took longer than we expected, and the photos did build up over time. We needed something else to bring the book alive visually, especially in the early chapters. There weren't enough photos. And I started chatting to Sean, and Sean doesn't do commissions. He basically chooses the project thing. And as we started chatting, he said, I want in on this. And his artwork has been absolutely incredible. He'll chat to you a lot more about that, I won't think. So we wanted to take a style, because we were pilots ourselves, we wanted to put the reader in the cockpit. Because the historians and the politicians, they've had enough time to tell the story of the war. Now time for the guys who are really there to tell the story in their style. So we wanted to put the reader in the cockpit of the MiG. It's a MiG-21. And use all of that to really put you in the situation, into the cockpit of the Impala as it streaks along low-level hunting helicopters. You know, we wanted to really put you there, get the feel for the moment. So that lets you live the moment. That's a Milton Diaz photo as well, of Mi-17 busy launching rockets at a target that he took them thing. So to do this, we needed buy-in from a bunch of guys to get those accounts. The Cubans. Eduardo did a lot of the work with that, chatted to them. He speaks the language. He's highly respected. He was a squadron commander there, 27 years in the Cuban Air Force. And he would get the accounts and then send them to me, and we'd work on the translations and try to put them together. Some of the accounts already appeared in some of his memoirs. That guy there sitting in the MiG, Flores, he was shot down and killed in 1986. And with my South African Air Force background, I hunted down a lot of my old South African Air Force colleagues and comrades, and gee, they just opened up and really gave me the stories. I think enough time had passed that there was no hard feelings anymore, and everyone was just ready to tell exactly what they could remember. And became very good friends with some Angolans and helicopter and MiG pilots, and they went out of their way to furnish me with their accounts. And I thought when I first approached them that I'd have experienced a bit of acrimony from them. Nothing, just professional courtesy, respect, and also wanted the story to be told. That photo there is of a chap who was shot down by the SAAF Impalas in 1985, 30th September 1985, in Tena Bravo, and the photo was given to me by his son, who was 1 year old at the time. So his son was so excited for the story of his dad to be told, dived back into the family archives and gave me quite a few photos. So that's unfortunately the quality of the photos is always an issue, but that's one of those that we could use. And then Soviet as well. That's Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Kushkov, and he really went out of his way to contribute and tell us so much more about flying the MiG and training people to fly the MiG. He was based in Luanda and ran an advanced combat training school in Luanda for a couple of years during the Bush War. So that's basically the foundation of the book. Now just to share one of the stories with the book with you, and that's to do with Mirage 203. And we've got one of the guys who was involved in that story sitting right here today, Cobus Toerien. So that day, the Canberras were going to go and do a reconnaissance not too far from Lubanga or south of Lubanga, and the previous sorties with the Canberras, they'd had MiG scrambled and they'd had to leave the scene and couldn't complete their photo reconnaissance sorties. So that day, the decision was that the Canberras were going to have a Mirage escort. So the Canberras took off from Grootfontein. They were going to fly right over Ondangwa, and as they're approaching Ondangwa, the Mirages were going to start up. So as the Canberras flashed over the runway at Ondangwa, the Mirages were lined up and ready to go. And Mirage 203 was going to be the lead Mirage, flown by Johan Rankin, and wingman in Mirage 209, Cobus Toerien, who's with us here today. So they were in the residence waiting for the word, and when the word came, it's time to start up. Cobus was fairly new on Mirages then, maybe about 1 year or so. And as he began starting the Mirage, so let me just grab this thing here. Apologies. As starting the Mirage, there's the start panel over there. So start had a problem, and the first start failed, and then had to wait for the engine to spool down before he can do the second start. By now, of course, the cameras were flashing across the runway. He was a youngster on the squadron, you're sweating, and Jan Rankin has many positive attributes. Patience is not among that list. And he was ready to go, and he couldn't understand why his wingman was not ready to go, and it was time to go. So finally, flash of hands and feet, Cobus got the Mirage started, and they were on their way. Worked out quite fortunately, because the cameras were well ahead of them. By the time the cameras pitched up, began the photo run, the Mirages were far away, still low level, and off the Angolan radar. So as the cameras began their photo run, one of the guys, the number 2 camera, was flown by General Des Barker, who's well known to the museum and made amazing contributions over the years. And the lead one was flown by, later on, General Bertus Berger. And what was happening in Lubanga at that stage was in the revetments at the new Air Force base at Lubanga were 2 MiGs on standby. They weren't these ones. These are actually the trainer MiGs, but it's only nice photo I had of MiG-21s in the revetments at Lubanga. But there were 2 MiG-21s in the revetment. They were MiG-21 MFs. One was C-49, and the other one was C-40. C-40 was the lead that day. C-49 would be the wingman. Rachel Moreira would be flying C-40, and Gilberto Ortiz C-49. Now what had happened was the MiG-21 MF were the original ones that were delivered in beginning of 1976. There were only 10 of them, C-40 to C-49, and C-41 had already been shot down the year previous. And what had happened was that a rule had been made that they shouldn't pair 2 rookie pilots together. But at that stage, no one was expecting cameras to come again. The senior guys hated sitting in the cockpit on standby, and they'd got themselves onto night flying the night before. All the senior MiG pilots, so they had the 12-hour rule, now they couldn't fly. So the 2 young rookies were told, jump in, you guys on cockpit standby. No one was expecting anything to happen. What could go wrong? And next thing, boom, on the radar, cameras. So they scrambled. They were armed with the missile you see there, which is the old-fashioned atoll. The MiG-21 MF that were in Angola weren't compatible with the latest generation missile, so those old atolls were basically almost a reverse-engineered Sidewinder B, and that was what they were armed with that day. And then accounts vary whether they had 2 tanks or 3 tanks, wing and belly tanks. But that missile, not a very effective missile, but the Bs, the later version of the MiG, had a more effective missile. That wasn't the aircraft on standby that day. They got airborne. There's just some photos. I'm just showing them because they're fairly unique. You won't see these photos anywhere else of MiG-21 MFs, still with the old style camouflage. They got airborne towards the Canberras, and then the Mirages popped up on the radar. And as the MiGs were vectoring to the Canberras, you can hear on the voice transcript, the Canberra guys, we got a voice transcript that was taped by the Canberra guys, you can hear them calling 2 deltas. 2 deltas. That was the MiG radars coming up on the thing. So they were picking up their 2 fighters closing in on them. Jan Rankin told the Canberras to disengage. They dived down and disengaged. The Mirage turned towards the MiG. Les Lombard pitched them and turned them towards the MiGs. And then the MiGs were also then turned towards the 2 new targets that came up, which were the 2 Mirage F1s. And they started flashing towards each other. So as the MiGs and the Mirage were approaching, you can hear on the transcript the tension in the voices as the distance closes. And then suddenly Jan Rankin shouts, "Tally-ho," and picked up the 2 MiGs. This is artwork by the late Rainer Siliers. I just included it today because I worked with him to try to get some of the details right. He asked me to work with him. But it just captures a moment. In Mirage 209, sitting there was Cobus, who's here with us today, and as he flashed past the 2 MiGs, they still had their drop tanks on. Now, the drop tank story is a very interesting one, because the MiGs themselves also picked up the Mirages climbing towards them. And in their account, they said, or Gilberto Ortiz picked them up first, he said from a distance he saw the Mirages fire their missiles because he saw a streak of white. The Mirages didn't fire their missiles, they dropped their RP-35 drop tanks. And as the drop tank falls away, that's the lug that holds it in place over there, as the drop tank falls away, the fuel is still in the pipe. So you get this white streak of fuel at the high altitude. And it looks like maybe a missile streak. So this, Cobus said, as he looked across and he saw Johan Rankin said drop tanks, he looked across at Johan, he saw Johan's tank fall away, he saw this white streak in the sky from the vaporizing fuel. And he realized this is getting real now. The MiGs saw that, they thought the Mirage had launched the missiles, but they hadn't. So they crossed, and as they crossed, Rachel Moreira decided they must drop their tanks now. Now on the MiG-21, the ergonomics are nowhere near as good as the Western aircraft, so you've got some switches on the front panel to drop the wing tanks, you've got switches on the control stick to drop the centerline body tank. The two MiG pilots can't remember if they had 3 tanks or 2 tanks that day, but while they were fiddling to drop their tanks, they were also flashing past the Mirages. And Cobus said he could see the MiG pilots head down in the cockpit. So these were 2 rookies. So Gilberto Ortiz had 275 hours, Rachel Moreira had 320 hours. And they were up against 2 really crack pilots from 3 Squadron. So as they struggled to drop their tanks, they dropped their tanks, they crossed. Johan Rankin turned right. Cobus couldn't turn right at this stage because he was so close to the MiGs, he had to wait till he was past them. So Johan Rankin turned in behind the MiGs, and Cobus had to wait a little while, and then he also turned and to follow the MiGs. And at that stage, Johan actually battled to catch the MiGs. They were the lead MiG pilot, Rachel Moreira, said they were an afterburner at that stage, and the direct translation for afterburner in Spanish is force. So you said we engaged the force, meaning engaged afterburner, and for a short while the force was with the MiGs, and they were outrunning the Mirages. And Cobus was just far behind playing catch up, and Johan Rankin had them visual. And then Johan Rankin said an interesting thing. He said the MiGs suddenly fired their missiles. So the MiGs were facing away from the Mirages. The Mirages were behind the MiGs, and the MiGs fired the missiles. It's never made sense to me over all the years. When we tracked down the MiG pilots, we found things. As they dropped their drop tanks, a similar thing happened to what happened with the Mirages. It left that streak of vaporizing fuel in the air. And Johan Rankin says that makes sense because the angle that he was at, the fuel tank that they dropped were these 490-liter tanks. They shaped, missile shaped, they got fins, and the angular geometry as they dropped looked like they actually were going away from the Mirage. Cobus suddenly then had what he thought was a jettison missile come tumbling past him. It was one of these tanks. He said it was long, thin, and had fins. But at Mach 1, he didn't have time to worry too much about what it was. Flashed past him, nearly took him out. It would have been an amazing kill by a MiG if it had. But flashed past, and then the chase was on. So Johan Rankin was chasing after the MiGs. And the missiles the Mirages were going to use is the Matra 550, which that generation missile not particularly effective. His first missile, he launched the, as you can see the Matra there on the actual wing of Mirage, he launched the first Matra out of range. The second, and it just went straight, just went ballistic. The second Matra, Cobus was watching it, and the second Matra did a corkscrew, which Cobus said later on from missile trials, they realized that means it's got a good tracking solution. So it was corkscrewing towards the rear MiG C-49, Gilberto Ortiz, who at this stage picks up the Mirages again in his rearview mirror. And he said he saw a big flash coming out from underneath the Mirage, and the Mirage started filling up his windscreen. He was yelling to his leader, the Mirage is behind us, Mirage is behind us, because the lead had lost sight. Lead wasn't responding, and next thing, that second missile, the second Matra, exploded just behind his MiG. That's one of the problems with this generation of missile. When an aircraft is an afterburner, it often blows up about 15, 20 meters behind the heat source. And there were a couple of scratches on Gilberto's MiG at the rear, but no damage whatsoever. The MiG was flying the next day. But his lead still wasn't responding to him, so Gilberto said, I'm out of here. That's basically the view the Mirage. He split est and left. At that stage, Johan Rankin was starting to close in on Rachel Moreira, who had begun a left turn, and now Johan Rankin was closing in rapidly. Got to about 2 missiles had been used up. Now it was time for the guns. Got to about 500 meters, good firing solution, and when Johan Rankin pressed the trigger, nothing happened. So there's a little safety catch, not the best diagram, but a little safety catch over there. So when it switched over to guns, the safety catch was still blocking the trigger from depressing. And that possibly saved Rachel Moreira's life, because instead of opening fire at 450, 500 meters, Johan had to quickly change the switch, and he opened fire at 230 meters, which is where you really want to stop firing. So he fired a burst. Well-known piece of gun camera footage. So MiG C-41 was hit by at least 3 rounds. And if you look at that gun camera footage and compare it to the previous one, this seems to be the most conclusive kill. I mean, it's just a fireball. It's just a huge fireball consumes the MiG. And because Johan Rankin was so close, he couldn't avoid that fireball. He went straight through it. And Cobus was watching the whole affair from about 1,000 meters back, and he said Johan went through the fireball, came out the other side, and his leading edge of his wings were alight. And at the same time, other side of the fireball emerged the MiG, pitched up, black smoke, decelerating rapidly. And then Johan called, I'm going down. Cobus looked towards him, looked back, the MiG was gone. And what had actually happened? Rachel Moreira had been very, very fortunate. The 3 rounds that hit him. The one that caused that big fireball was that piece of damage over there. So the round hit in the left wing there. Now the left wing has about 250 liters of fuel, and because they'd been carrying extra drop tanks, they'd used very little of the wing tank fuel. So that fuel exploded, and it exploded outwards. The whole fireball consuming the MiG, but the MiG itself, you'll see later, even the paintwork was hardly damaged because these guys were above Mach 1. This explosion going outwards. Peeling back the metal top and below, and that's a view from the top. Now, the Mirages had disappeared. Rachel Moreira didn't know that, but his MiG was still flying, but it wasn't flying very well. That there is the fuel line, or the fuel pipe, on the tank that's ruptured, and then you'll see there's a thin little pipe there. That's the hydraulic pipe to the left aileron. So his aileron booster wasn't working, so he didn't have left aileron. He had a huge amount of drag on the left-hand side with all that metal hanging into the air. So he had to use full right rudder to keep the aircraft straight. And but it was still flying. That's just a closer shot of the fuel pipe there, and then the hydraulic line to the booster. One of the other rounds had also hit near the exhaust cone. Now, inside that exhaust cone, the MiG engine exhaust has got petals, just like a Mirage or something. Those petals on the left-hand side had been damaged. So the right-hand petals were okay, the left-hand petals were damaged, and that caused the thrust to come out asymmetrically as well. The left side wasn't coming out well, the right side was coming out strong. That also caused a further yaw to left, so further right rudder required by Rachel Moreira. And the engine itself, with the petals being damaged, couldn't produce its power, so it was producing about 85% power, dry power, because it was out of afterburner at that stage. Now, any of you know about jet engines, and a lot of you do know that jet engine power is hyperbolic. So from 80% power to 100% power is almost double. So he had very limited power to fly with. And so he managed to get the aircraft back to Lubongo. In the tower was an experienced MiG pilot who spoke him down, told him not to use any more flap than 25%, because otherwise it becomes blown flap and you have to duct more bleed air away from the engine. And his landing gear extended remarkably. None of those hydraulic lines had been damaged. The MiG-21's got a very good system of self-sealing its fuel tanks, so he still had the body tank fuel. Got back to Lubanga and everybody said he really greased it down. So the youngster got himself into trouble. He got himself into combat where he was completely out of his depth, but then did an awesome job of getting the MiG back to Lubanga. So radio transcripts or radio intercepts heard that there were undercarriage problems and things. So the SAAF thought that this MiG had been blown up, and the second MiG, C-49, was the one that had got back with landing gear problems. Meanwhile, C-49 got back fine, and C-40 got back by the skin of his teeth. Moreira and Gilberto Ortiz walked across to each other, gave each other a big hug. They just couldn't believe that what they had just escaped. So what were the outcomes on the SAAF side? So Johan Rankin managed to do a restart on his engine. Cobus managed to find him. They managed to form up again, come back to Ondangwa. Once they landed on the ground, the champagne flowed, because when you look at that gun camera footage, it was thought to be a kill. But Cobus, who had seen the MiG emerge, said to some of the higher-up guys, well, and to Johan Rankin, I saw the MiG come out, and then I don't know what happened. He was flying, he wasn't looking very healthy, but he was flying. And the higher-ups had a look at the gun camera footage. Johan Rankin came to Cobus and said, you know what, Cobus, it's not our call. And Johan Rankin never claimed the kill. There was enough doubt in his mind that he never claimed the kill. He said, I was too busy, I was going through the fireball trying to get my engine restarted. What Cobus had said to him put enough doubt in his mind and said, let's leave it for the higher-ups to make the call. So SAAF HQ made the call, and they made it a kill. And that's how Mirage 203 got its kill mark. There's another outcome of this, is that the SAAF had had great success against the MiG-21 pilots. And that created a problem, because in all these engagements, the Matra 550 had been a failure. And that got overlooked, not by the fighter pilots, but by HQ and the logistics guys. They said, but you guys are doing a great job. So later on, when the Mirage would come up against a far more formidable opponent, the MiG-23, with a far more formidable radar and missile system, the Mirage pilots would end up being outgunned. And that's one of the outcomes. The competence of Johan Rankin and the rest of his squadron mates in those years masked the fact that the SAAF was getting left behind. Outcomes on the Cuban side. Well, it's quite interesting. That day, another set of MiGs was scrambled. When the Mirages engaged the MiGs, they scrambled another 2 MiGs. Now, when you start looking at the Bush War, the same names start coming up again and again. You know, the Johan Rankins and thing. And there's a couple of Cuban pilots who, interestingly, their names also come up a few times. But those two MiGs that were scrambled were MiG-21Bs, because now the senior guys were suddenly interested. And now they jumped in the MiG-21s, they were on their way with the Bs. Now, if those 2 MiGs had been the Bs instead of the MF, the Mirages wouldn't have even got close, because the Bs was the later model. It had a much more powerful engine. It had something in the vicinity of 3,000 kilograms, just under 3,000 kilograms more thrust. So if you put the burn on that, the Mirage F1's never going to catch it. But of course, he'll run away from the Mirage, but as soon as he's outrun the Mirage, he won't make it back to base because he's used so much fuel. But so 2 Bs were scrambled. The lead of the Bs was a guy called Orestes Lorenzo. And he later on would defect to America in that MiG-23BN. And Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria would go to Florida to Boca Chica and pick up that MiG and fly it back to Cuba. That's Eduardo taking off out of Boca Chica, turning and burning on his way back to Cuba. So it's amazing how this can happen. But the wingman of the 2 that were scrambled that day would be Alberto Ley over there. Eventually, they never got there in time to see the Mirages, so by the time they got there, the Mirages were gone. But Alberto Ley, the interesting character, he flew MiG-17s in Angola in the early days, then now MiG-21s, and he is the guy who later would have a combat against Arthur Piercy in MiG-441. By then he was on MiG-23s. So Alberto Ley missed seeing the SAAF guys that day, but he would see them later on. The exact MiG that he was flying that day was MiG C-63. We know that from his logbook. He was scrambled in MiG C-63, which is one of the very early B's models. The early B's models had two numerals, C-63, C-62. The later ones, like the one we had at the museum, they had the 340 and so on. And they were also armed with a more advanced R-13M missile, which is equivalent to a midlife Sidewinder about. And then the final outcomes is that when working on the book together, Eduardo came out to South Africa, and here he is, Mirage 203, Cobus Toerien, met Arthur Piercy, guys who all have a long history and connection with the museum. Also, he had a chance to have a chat with the famous Gringo, who did so much of the museum over all the years, Glenn Warden, yeah, they were babbling away in Spanish to each other much better for a while. And that brings us full circle, back to that little old man having a look at Mirage 203. That was quite a story behind that. And we then set about this book. We just thought that this would be a story that was an incredible story, had to be told. And in the process, we tried to write a book that would take the reader on the same unforgettable journey we went on while we were busy writing this book. Thanks, everyone.
And there was that lovely photograph of Eduardo and Glenn Warden. You see Glenn's body language, and he was my instructor, so I know how to read him. You see how he leans forward like this, and you see Eduardo kind of standing like this. There's a very clear gradient there. And I introduced the two of them, and I'll never forget it. Glenn, in his typical style, launched into Spanish, and it was blah, 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 blah. And Eduardo did that little thing, and he goes, "Ay caramba." It was one of those moments that one will never forget. Anyway, so when illustrating a book like this, obviously it's not going to be an unemotional, cold diagram, airplane picture. Pictures also tell a story, and that was part of the fun and why I took on the project, because I realized immediately that there was such a story here that my challenge was how to tell part of the story in each picture. And I'm just going to take you through a couple and hopefully explain the process. This is one of the early chapters, and it's about a very resourceful quartermaster on the Air Force Base at what was then Serpa Pinto, Manong. And the reason why I particularly like this is because they had 2 MiG-21s, but they had 6 MiG-17s on the base. And the MiG-17 on its own is a beautiful airplane to draw. But the lovely thing is that the story goes there were cattle that were roving around, and the guys were sick and tired of eating what is the equivalent of bully beef. It was van der Laan tinned meat. It was giving them the trots. So the quartermaster decides that he, for safety reasons, needs to kill one of these cattle, and they're busy working out how they're going to explain this away, but obviously flight safety always somehow comes into it. And I think that you can see that tells a story already on its own when you see that particular thing. But I was saying about the MiG-17, if you look at this photograph, luckily I'm one of the people, and Lionel is as well, who love MiGs. Russian airplanes are actually often quite ugly, but that ugliness can actually be very artistic. And so you can see those beautiful lines and the complex structure of the MiG-17 canopy alone is enough reason to draw that picture. This is a story that tells itself in many ways. You can see this is what you call being split arse. There's no doubt that this guy's taken off. This is Eduardo. This is something he loved doing. And when you meet him, you can already see it. He's got it in him. He's got all that Spanish jive. And they even talk about this as he's dancing. We call this picture flamenco, because the other guys commented that whenever Eduardo took off, it looked as if he was doing a flamenco. And you can see that's the effect you want to get of the gear coming in, low level, as he turns with the incredible power that the MiG-23 has. a nice thing about this story as well is that it's only armed with 2 rocket pods, 2 UB-16 rocket pods, and the rival squadron, I think the MiG-21 guys called it the Doves of Peace. So that's just a little aside to that story. Then sometimes sketching, you don't have to do much to tell the story. This is just a case of using an eraser and a little bit of extra pencil, but you know immediately what that is. Everybody knows when something is going supersonic or really fast. But this particular story, the guy's called Fatso, he's the wingman to Eduardo, and he gets into a really heated engagement where there's a lot of anti-aircraft fire. And he accelerates like hell and starts running supersonic at low level, explaining how dangerous the situation was. And in fact, it's all about being a militant. Eduardo asked him, "Are you a militant now?" But you can see the drawing. You have a choice of angle. Either it's going to come towards you or it's going to run away. And you can tell this aircraft is running away. All those choices or those decisions make a difference to how the story is told. Research is often a problem with this because the photographs are rare, and in fact Lionel has the best stash of photographs of anybody probably in the world now of Angolan aircraft, but also the background. And this I took one night flying from Joburg to Kinshasa over the middle of Angola because I wanted an authentic background for the next drawing, which happens to be the night launch from the chapter Starry Night. And if you have a look, you'll see exactly what my inspiration is. So the research is all very authentic. Sorry, well, yeah. So that's the photograph I took out of the 737 the night that I flew to Kinshasa. Yeah, on its own. But I thought it was a great inspiration for that because it's such a moment to capture. A night launch of a missile, and a very brave Cuban pilot, I must say, to be in amongst those hills at night, supersonic, hard to believe. All right, then on the topic of research, this is an interesting thing because you have a look at the camouflage on that helicopter. You see a very distinct pattern, and they call it amoeba. I only discovered this years after having drawn it. And all the aircraft, all the Mi-24s and 25s that were in Afghanistan had this camouflage, and I assume that this is in Angola. This could probably or possibly have been one of the aircraft that was in Afghanistan, and it came out with this camo. And when doing the next drawing, I wanted to incorporate the amoeba pattern as well because it's so unique. It was actually used by snipers, Russian snipers in the Second World War. For some reason, they got an idea that this organic amoeba shape was going to be effective. I can't imagine how it was in the snow of Russia. But anyway, here's a story that tells itself as well because it's almost like watching a Western movie in the old days where you can see the baddies coming and you know that the hero of the story can't see them. You want to go, watch out, there's somebody behind you. And you can tell they don't know. And this is from the chapter Humble Assassin, and that's an Impala coming up behind, obviously, and he's about to shoot this Mi-25 down. What is interesting about this drawing is the aspect of scale. Many combat drawings show aircraft like this. And you want to go, oh, man, you never get that close. It's just not the way it looks. And non-pilots who paint and draw often do this. And that was the whole thing, was to try and get... Now, I can only draw so fine, so this even is a little bit too close. It would be even smaller in real life if you compared the two, but there's the limitation, surely, of paper size and pencil sharpness. And that's going to come out again in the next drawing, which is called Break Left. Here, David Kleinans in the closest F1AZ, he narrowly escaped with his life in this situation. That MiG-23 over there, Eladio was flying it. He had selected his missile selector on auto, and it unfortunately didn't select the right missiles. If he had selected the belly station, David Kleinans probably wouldn't be with us anymore. He's a friend of mine who also flew at SAA. And Reg van Eerden seen in the distance, he's already jettisoned his tanks. And I chose to keep the tanks on here just for the hell of it, for the drawing. But you can sense the fact that that aircraft was under dire threat, and you can feel the fear in the formation breaking left. And once again, the issue of scale comes in here. This here is Trompinel, who's flying this AZ, and a very lucky Orlando. What was Orlando's surname? Carbo. Yeah. Yeah, Carbo. Also very lucky here because of the way luck turns out sometimes. Trompi didn't get a shot because of the sun and where Johan Rankin was. And so Orlando escapes with his life out of this situation. There's an interesting thing about doing this drawing is that in this engagement, a lot is said about the length of the afterburner plume, because it's quite a significant feature when you're fighting an airplane like a MiG-23 with that old afterburning engine. It made a hell of a long plume. And on white paper, you can't really capture it by doing an outline. It just looks silly. So I started to use these gray blocks so that I could capture whatever I wanted. And there you can see the afterburner plume. And then later on in the book, the gray block became part of my style, if you could call it that. Telling the story doesn't always have to be accurate. You can embellish a little bit. And with Eduardo's agreement over here, in a chapter about resilience after his time in the Air Force, he has to take a job as a taxi driver. But he actually drove a Moscovich taxi, which looks more like the one in the background. But I thought, hell, nobody wants to see an ugly communist-built car like that. It's much nicer to have the old restored Chevy. This is a 1950 Chevy Deluxe. It's called a Styline Deluxe, and there are many of them around Havana. And so I put him in that car, in the Havana street. And if you know Havana, you would know that the old-fashioned building sticking up above the skyline there is the Telcom Tower, or their telecom tower, and that is a very uniquely Cuban story, even though it's not accurate. The Cuban story, obviously not having been to Cuba myself, still is a major part. If you want to do art like this, you've got to have a feel for what's going on. And when deciding how to do the cover painting, one of the important things, obviously it's going to be a MiG-23, that was known, but what to do in the background. And the more I looked at photographs of Cuba, the more this came up. On walls, on toilet doors, wherever, it's just like, where are you? Oh no, we're in Cuba, because the flag is everywhere. And so now it would probably make sense why that happened. And the nice thing about this, a slightly tatty flag. It also tells a story. You can see the ends over here. It's slightly torn, but it's billowing, and it's nice because it echoes with the drag chute, and it tells a story on its own. One look, and you know what the story is about. This was a hell of a project. I really enjoyed it. And thankfully we had COVID. Otherwise, this painting would never have got finished. The amount of detail that went into that airplane, because we're both model builders, and we love all the detail. Those missiles alone must have taken me a month. Here's an interesting thing. If you have a copy of the book and you go to page 100, you're going to see an interesting thing, and I'll show you here. If you turn your hymnal to page 100, we can all sing along. Sometimes when setting up the pages of the book, you have a situation where you have to move the picture left or right, or at the top or at the bottom, and we had this whole open block underneath the text, and we wanted to do something different. But the actual drawing, the original drawing, is that. And Lionel is now the owner of the most expensive drawing of dust ever imagined. Oh, don't tell me it's died. There. That's what happened. 1 week, and I charged him full price for it. As a final aside, when doing a lot of research, which is actually just another name for going down the rabbit hole in the internet, I came across this lovely photo of a MiG-17. I don't know which base this is, but what I loved is what's happening on the wall in the background, where it says Viva Marxisma and Viva Leninisma. And there you have Lenin, Marx, and Engels in that beautiful stylistic mural that the propaganda people love doing in communist countries. And it snuck in to this painting. Where's that little pointer? When I was doing this, I had to modify the hanger. I loved the structure, the collapsed structure, because all of this shows the ruin. The eventual end of the story is actually a ruin. This was a MiG-23 that was flown by Executive Outcomes, our very own South African fighter pilots flying the MiGs that Eduardo flew, a strange story in itself. But you'll see there in the corner on the wall, I snuck in that same mural just to get an idea of the collapse of communism in some way and the end of the Cuban story in Angola. And so that's it. Drawings can also tell stories. You just got to have an eye for detail, know what you want to tell, bullshit a little bit, and look for the fine stuff. It makes all the difference. Thanks.